Good afternoon, and welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the 8th in a series of noon lectures sponsored by the Associated Student Speakers Program. We are honored to have as our guest today the Honorable Jesse Unruh, Speaker of the Assembly of the State of California and a Regent ex officio of the University. In 1960, Mr. Unruh was the first major political figure in California to join the Kennedy for President movement. He led the Kennedy forces in the California delegation to the Democratic National Convention and served as manager of the Kennedy campaign in Southern California. He was elected Speaker in 1961 and has served in that office for a longer period than anyone else in California history. As a regent, he has consistently opposed the imposition of any tuition on the university students. His aptitude for the legislative and political processes have been widely hailed, to the point where Saturday Review could refer to him recently as, quote, the most powerful state legislative leader in the United States, and, some think, the nation's most brilliant politician. Following his presentation, as according to our general format, there will be the question and answer period. Now it gives me great pleasure to present the Honorable Jesse Marvin Unruh.
Thank you very much. That reference by Saturday Review to the some who think was right after they interviewed my wife, who incidentally is here today, and I'd like you to meet her wherever she is. Virginia? There you go. I am glad to be here with you today. It's really not all that much of a compliment, however, because nowadays it's just nice to be away from Sacramento for a while. Really, I'm here on a sort of a fact-finding tour. You know, this is the way most fact-finders come in. And among other things, I've decided that there really is no reason at all for you to complain about the parking. Now, I drove up here today, and right away I got a parking space. I think it is appropriate that I am here to speak to you a couple of days before I meet with my fellow regents to decide whether or not you will have to pay a new tuition or fee or charge or tribute or whatever the regents may choose to call it this month. And I don't intend to dwell very long on that volatile subject, except to point out that the imminence of that crucial vote ought to induce a more practical among you to treat a regent like me with due respect, in spite of some of the actions of the board on which I serve. You know, I am a member of the Board of Regents. I'm also a member of the State College Board of Trustees, and I'm a member of the State Disaster Council. Until this administration came along, I never understood the connection between the first two and the latter. What is most disturbing about tuition and the broader issue of the university budget is that for the first time, the economic power of the state, the power to tax through the device of tuition, and the power to influence curriculum through the device of the budget cut is being used against higher education in California. And the debate over the propriety of this is all but ignored today. Now, to further extricate myself from the details of the decisions which the Board of Regents face this week, let me broaden the context of this argument even more The world today seems to have more than the usual complement of people eager to define the purpose of a university and also eager to condemn any institution that does not meet their definition as betraying its trust. And under the circumstances, it is quite justifiable, even necessary, to apply the pressure of a state against those institutions which are found wanting, always in terms, of course, of the definition that you happen to be using. Now, this same device is being used increasingly with reference to other institutions in our society. We tend to define the institutions in terms of some ideal, and then take repressive measures when the institution does not conform. And this negative approach is today very, very politically popular. One of the most immediate and shocking examples of this is the approach that Congress took last year on the question of welfare. As you may know, amendments to the Social Security Act were adopted which freezes the aid to families with dependent children programs in the several states at their present percentage levels. By a nearly unanimous vote, Congress not only denied help to those who need it, it also attempted to contradict biological reality. Now, the reasons for this first punitive welfare legislation ever passed by a United States Congress, not really very hard to identify. First of all, I suppose Congress wanted to limit a fast-growing welfare program. But beyond that is the shattered ideal that the AFDC program is, or was, in the minds of many, a program to help deserving white middle-class widows rear their children in temporary times of financial difficulty. But reality isn't like that. More and more the participants of that program are Negroes. And more recipients' parents are not married. Now, somehow the program was viewed as encouraging immorality. So the ideal was shattered. The definition did not fit reality. Now, I don't mean to imply that this negativism is solely the characteristic of the political right. The sounds of shattering dreams, the cries of frustration can be heard from both sides. And the word crisis has become an essential part of the political jargon of both the right and the left. We speak today of a crisis of the cities, crisis in Asia, crisis in race relations, crisis in welfare, the communist crisis, the dollar crisis, and they all may be more or less real. But the heavy dependence upon the idea of crisis hardly makes for dispassionate and rational consideration of the problems. What the crisis mentality does lead us to, quite logically, is a desire to destroy the social institutions which have brought that crisis about, and hopefully, and just hopefully, to begin again. Though I want to clearly disassociate myself from the idea that a total destruction is a necessary prelude, I do believe that our society needs the opportunity to make a new beginning. And those of the new left who insist that we can only rebuild upon the rubble of all of our present institutions must, I think, be closely looked at. To the degree that the new left demands total destruction of our institutions as the price of admission to the free and peaceful society that they envision, to that degree have they cast their lot with that more entrenched and respectable element among us which looks upon nuclear welfare as a happy solution to all of our complex foreign problems. Is there any radical in America who feels that he could not yield to Mendel Rivers in his prescription for destruction? I think today we must approach this new beginning with some sense of priorities. We must determine what degree of destruction our society can reasonably sustain and what institutions really should be abandoned. Because no institution in of itself is good or bad. It is only through the uses to which men put them that institutions achieve value, both practical and moral. And the idea that a better and purer society can be brought about by the destruction of the old corrupt one is not new. It is simply naive. The purgation of the Roman Empire by the Germanic tribes hardly improved the human condition 2,000 years ago. And frankly, if I had to choose, I would prefer Marie Antoinette to Madame Defarge. We put an end to a Kaiser to make way for a Führer. And even today, we can reasonably question the value of bringing down the Diem regime, only to replace it with Generals Chiu and Key. Furthermore, this kind of social purgation through destruction is neither quick nor easy. It can be brought about only by the protracted application of the kind of excessive brutality that critics who seek a new society find most repugnant about the old one. And those who survive do not forget. A method for eliminating the brutal among us without brutalizing the executioners seems to have eluded mankind throughout all of his existence. This, I think, is brought home clearly in the peace demonstrations against a war considered unjust and brutal. But often, the demonstrators verge on and slop over into the violence they profess to abhor. I think we will have to accept the idea that the prejudices which cause men to do all the deplorable things they do, that cause them to subvert what should be desirable, what cause them to abandon and destroy and subvert useful institutions, that cause them to alienate and reject whole segments of society, I think we will have to accept that these prejudices are the accretion of years of preaching and practice and habit. And I think we will have to accept that they can only be removed in the same way they were formed. Let me try to indicate to you some of the things that motivate my generation. And most of the people in power today, who are my age and somewhat older, possibly, just possibly, it might help you to understand us better. And if not that, at least to make it a little harder for you to reject us. And I want to start out by not arguing that we are right, but rather that you help us to change. The central reality of the youth of my time was economic. In one word, the Depression. And in an atmosphere of deprivation and keen competition, it was only natural that the toughest, most ruthless people would survive. And those who emerged from that depression share a common fear of the kind of deprivation that characterized it. And they continue in that fear, even over the terror implicit in a cold and a hot war. The character of American government during those times changed. The federal government grew at the expense of state government. And under those circumstances, thank God it did. But it does present us now with a set of attitudes that those of us in state government find very difficult to deal with or to change. And the political leadership of that era was breathtaking, and it left its stamp upon the character of political leadership which has followed. The attempt to deal with poverty was all but revolutionary in America at that time, and to deal with it effectively remains today a depressingly distant goal. Caroline Bird described this legacy of poverty and political leadership in her excellent book, The Invisible Scar, when she said, "The self-perpetuating poor who dismay us now are the children of the people of the New Deal, that the New Deal left out. And the remedies of President Johnson suggests are lifted whole cloth from the times of President Roosevelt. The principal difference is in numbers. In those days, 1 out of every 4 employable people was unemployed, instead of 1 out of 20. And Roosevelt saw 1/3 of America poor instead of 1/5. If you went by contemporary reference, she said, to the Depression, you might get an idea that the Depression was a faceless menace. In truth, it was as explicit as a statistic and as tangible as a wound. It's necessary, I think, today for you to understand that from time to time that old wound is reopened, and that my generation sometimes acts in response to pain rather than in rational argument. Let me offer myself as an example. I have to confess to an immediate feeling of revulsion at the sight of a barefooted flower child, quite apart from their philosophical convictions or their forms of social criticism. What repels me, I think, is the memory of my youth in Texas, where 4 of us in my family used to share one pair of shoes. Where to be barefoot in public was to be poor and ashamed. That's an irrational response, I'm sure, even an unworthy one. But these kind of memories die hard. As a further illustration of this, let me confess that I had a momentary feeling of rage as I watched on television recently the uprising at San Francisco State College. Now, it really wasn't so much the antics of the rioters in general which disturbed me. I found a couple of them quite amusing. But one single act that I think was covered by newsmen that really bugged me. And I suspect it did that for largely the same reason to many others of my generation. That was the breaking of a glass door. To me, the breaking of that glass had a very special meaning. When I was a child, a broken window was not something to be dismissed and to have repaired. It was something you patched, lived with through the months, maybe the years, until a family could afford a new one. That meant that in winter you either had no light coming in or no warmth staying in. That window meant being cold or being dark. And that's the reason I think that I and so many others felt a surge of unreasonable anger at the sight of that breaking door at San Francisco State College. And that kind of response is a large part of the reason that my generation is so difficult for you to understand. Our flower children, the flower children of the 1930s, died in the hobo camps, in the drafty barns, and the welfare lines. And those of us who survived that desperate struggle live with those memories, memories that haunt and motivate us just as much as the death and fear of Vietnam motivates you. Those memories push us over the rat race, ever on in that rat race, for fear that today everything will disappear and we'll be back there. A secure 9-to-5 job, a house in the suburbs, 2 cars and a swimming pool were such distant goals for so many people for so many years that they became obsessed with them. I suppose it's incomprehensible to many in my generation that you are not similarly obsessed. But there is a promise in that. And the promise in this is that your freedom from those kind of memories that haunt and torment my generation may make it possible for you to change society in ways that we never can. On the other hand, we may have lost something in this current atmosphere of affluence which characterizes so much of American life. The Depression did give all of us some sense of community. Everybody was in it together. We were all poor. And it was this, I believe, that really sustained the political revolution, which was the New Deal. In the 1930s, when Franklin Roosevelt said that I see 1/3 of a nation ill-housed, ill-clad, ill-nourished, most other Americans saw it too, because only a few of them were any better off. But today our affluence, our technical progress, and the growth of modern government have isolated, bewildered, and embittered many Americans. And that process of isolation and alienation continues. Those of us with money and white skin and an education continue the flight to the suburbs, deserting the core cities to black smog, black people, and black despair. We continue to build our better schools, our new houses, financed largely with government loans, and incidentally almost all of our new universities in these enclaves of white Anglo-Saxon cleanliness and virtue. And just to make sure that they're not tainted, we invoke the sacred right of private property, supported by incorporation and annexation laws and home rule, to contain successfully those too poor and too black to follow us. history may record that that's the only United States containment policy that ever worked. We tax ourselves, it's true, but only just enough, just barely enough, to build warehouses in which to keep all those people that we don't want to see around, all those who are not beautiful people, the sick, the crippled, the old, the retarded, the mentally ill. And we support a bewildering multiplicity of programs which purport to train and employ the unemployed, but which in fact harass and emasculate those among us who are particularly in need of special encouragement. We provide marginal sustenance for those that we are not quite brazen enough yet to institutionalize, so that our consciences, if not clean, are at least laundered. The implications of this rapidly widening alienation in our society are terrifying. Eric Hoffer writes that to have a grievance is to have a purpose in life. A grievance can almost serve as a substitute for hope. And it not infrequently happens that those who hunger for hope give their allegiance to him who offers them a grievance. We've made it easy today, too easy, for those who offer grievances, both to alienated blacks and frightened whites. Our political jargon encourages hostility and reinforces the isolation of our brothers. We have created a climate in which demagogues who feed upon our fears and divisions flourish. And we can see ample evidence in our own state that ignorance and hostility can be converted into political popularity. We have, in fact, today changed the terms of the political argument. The pressure on those in power that used to be exerted by a demand from the extremes that society be destroyed is no longer mere pressure. To some, it is seen by far as the most logical next step. If there is a generation gap dividing you and me, surely it's the least consequential of the many gaps in our society. The real gaps that must be bridged, the racial gap, the poverty gap, the gap in motivation, which is bringing about the inexorable putrefaction of our environment. Got ahead of myself. Now, if I was the governor, I'd had a quick little line to recover that. I need to practice a little bit on that. Those are the real gaps that we have to face. And none of those problems are really new. Unfortunately, they're so old that much of the drama of dealing with them has already worn off. Some of us are trying, and I think some of us are approaching these problems in imaginative ways. But by and large, the political task of our time is the not so simple one of simple communication. The scientist and the artist can be generations ahead of his time, but the greatest politician can never be more than a step or two ahead of his. In order to function, the politician, whatever his motivation, needs the understanding and support of a working majority. If that crumbles, then political solutions become impossible. And the political solution, I submit, is not only the best, but often the only way to settle our differences short of armed conflict, and to allow our frustrations and our impatience to lead us to abandon the political process can be nothing but the prelude to chaos. Am I championing the cause of politics? And the politician may sound self-serving. Perhaps it is. But I think, too, that we politicians can point to accomplishments of which we can be proud. Through a series of delicate and continuing political settlements, we have produced a nuclear non-proliferation treaty which has somewhat lessened the likelihood of atomic holocaust. And politicians largely in America, have made America aware once again of the poverty in our midst and have launched an attack, however imperfect that attack is, on this human scourge. And it is through politics, not violence, that we are making progress, gradual though it may be, toward guaranteeing the civil rights of our fellow citizens. And the political realm is broadening. Politics will have an ever-increasing influence upon the quality of our lives. The problems we face today are great, but our resources for solving them are equally great. And it is through the political process that we can bring those resources to bear on our problems. Our technology has tremendously increased the range of political choices. So much so that Emmanuel Mestlany says that today the factors that limited man's physical environs no longer exist. There is hardly any physical problem today that we cannot think of a solution for in, if not 1 year or 5 years, 10 years or 20 years. So that the age-old question which politicians and political leaders have throughout the years asked themselves of what can we do is no longer apropos. The proper question today is what do we want to do? What kind of a life do we really want to live? What kind of a world do we want to make of this? What kind of lives do we want our children to live? There are those who insist that we shrink from making those choices, that we dare not tamper with the human condition. But I feel confident that neither your generation nor mine will yield to this kind of timidity. For a while we may be frightened and unsure, and the problems that we face may be so staggering that if we feel we are responsible for their ultimate solution, their total solution, that will freeze us into inaction. But that will not last. It cannot last, and it must not last. I believe that we can accept the challenge implicit in the fact that we can decide what kind of a world we want for ourselves and for our children, and for all of the world. If we make the commitment, we can reach the goal. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.